Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a genuinely fascinating and completely objective unpacking of a major economic and political framework from our source material. So, you know how our daily news cycle just looks like absolute chaos right now? Well, this theory attempts to explain all of that not as random noise, but as a massive, highly calculated global economic shift. Now, our goal today isn't to take sides, but to really thoroughly explore this framework so you can understand the deep structural arguments being made by its proponents. To start, we have to pose the core premise of our source. What really drives modern political disruption? According to the speakers in our material, today's chaotic political landscape isn't just about personalities or standard partisan bickering. No, they argue that we're actually witnessing a profound structural transition, a massive shift away from an international banking cartel system, and a move toward an economy driven by sovereign nation-states. Okay, let's dive right into our roadmap for this. We're going to look at two rival economic systems, define the American system, explore how it's being modernized today, examine the alleged geopolitical pushback, and finally, decode modern political narratives. Let's get to it. Section 1. Two rival economic systems, the 18th century roots of modern disruption. So to understand the modern political claims making headlines today, our source insists that we first have to rewind the clock. We literally have to go back to an intense economic debate dating all the way back to the 18th century. And this brilliantly illustrates two completely opposing worldviews. On one side, you have what they call the American system, which focuses heavily on sovereign physical production, using high tariffs and uplifting the labor force through new discoveries. On the flip side, you have the British system, and the speakers define this as prioritizing free trade, financial speculation, and wealth extraction over actual physical development. Let's really anchor our discussion by defining this American system. Our source makes a big point that this isn't just some generic buzzword, it's a specific economic framework invented by Alexander Hamilton. And rather than relying on a purely speculative or financial economy, Hamilton's system uses credit specifically as a mechanism to increase tangible, physical production. The whole goal is to elevate the labor force, encourage human creativity, and ultimately ensure the nation produces what it needs to remain truly sovereign. Section 2. Defining the American system. Tracing the historical lineage. Now that we have that definition, let's move to and see how this builds across history. The speakers in our source trace a direct, unbroken historical line from America's founding right up to today. Watch how this evolves. In the 1790s, Hamilton used credit to spark physical production and pull the young nation out of debt. Fast forward to the 1860s, and the speakers argue Abraham Lincoln won the Civil War not just with battlefield tactics, but through the massive industrial logistics provided by this exact economic model. By the 1890s, President William McKinley famously ran the entire national budget purely through tariffs, literally zero income tax. And now, in the 2020s, the source alleges that Donald Trump is aggressively reviving this very framework. To really reinforce this historical continuity, the source brings up Abraham Lincoln's key economic advisor, Henry Carey. In his famous book, The Harmony of Interests, Carey explicitly defined this exact dichotomy. He said, "There are two systems before the world. The British system, of free trade and domination, and the American system, where labor is the most important driver." The speakers argue that this specific blueprint from Carey is exactly what's being deployed right now.
Section 3. Modernizing Hamilton's economic theory. Applying 18th century ideas to 21st century policy.
So you might be wondering, how does an 18th century economic theory actually translate into 21st century policy? Let's explore how the speakers map these exact concepts directly onto current political platforms, specifically Donald Trump's. So, the crucial point is that this translates into tangible action today through a few key avenues. First, by achieving massive domestic energy production to ensure self-sufficiency. Second, by treating Latin American nations as sovereign partners to help them develop, rather than just extracting their wealth. Third, through executive actions pushing to block illegal aliens and international cartels from using the U.S. banking system. And finally, by forcefully shifting the nation's focus away from speculative finance and back toward physical manufacturing. To really highlight the practical effect of this physical economy, the speakers point straight to the energy market. They argue that given the current state of global conflict, traditional economic models would predict oil spiking to around $200 a barrel. But because of the massive domestic supply unleashed by this new sovereign focus, oil has stayed hovering right near $90. For the source, this is absolute proof of the tangible power of a production-first mindset. But the source argues this whole thing isn't just about dollars and cents. It's a deeply psychological argument, too. They suggest that part of this strategy involves setting massive, monumental physical goals on what they call Trump time. We're talking things like going to Mars or developing fusion power. The idea is that by setting these crazy, boundary-pushing targets, the population is forced to drop the mindset of seeking handouts. Instead, they adopt a highly creative, productive, and incredibly optimistic national identity. Section 4. The alleged geopolitical pushback. The establishment's fierce resistance. Naturally, upending the entire global economic system doesn't exactly happen quietly, right? This brings us to the geopolitical consequences. The source heavily alleges that this sudden return to the American system is causing sheer panic and fierce resistance among entrenched global power structures. The speakers impartially outline this alleged resistance across a few fronts. They claim traditionally trained economists are basically in shock because this approach completely defies Milton Friedman's theories of free trade. They assert that major financial hubs, specifically the City of London, are panicking as they lose billions in illicit offshore black economy flows due to new banking sanctions. They also point to elements in the U.S. Congress, like the Problem Solvers Caucus, who they claim are actively trying to block troop withdrawals to maintain foreign entanglements. And finally, they note that third-way politicians are just scrambling in real time to adapt to this massive shift. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is a specific, super surprising example the source uses, involving globalist architects like former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. They assert that figures like Blair are suddenly writing essays dropping their long-held net-zero climate policies. According to this theory, they are pivoting hard back to fossil fuels and reindustrialization, literally just as a survival tactic to ingratiate themselves with this rapidly growing sovereign movement. The source also levels some really highly charged allegations about the intelligence community's role in this resistance. They detail a claim involving Julian Assange and the Vault 7 leak. According to the speakers, Assange offered the Justice Department proof regarding the source of hacked emails in exchange for immunity, a deal the Justice Department allegedly actually considered. However, the source claims figures like Senator Mark Warner actively intervened to block this deal, suppressing the evidence to protect the old system's narratives. Section 5. Decoding modern political narratives. Understanding media rhetoric through this new lens. This brings us to our final section. How do the speakers believe this massive underlying economic friction explains all the confusing and, frankly, often hysterical rhetoric we see in the daily news cycle? Well, the speakers argue that the establishment is actively trying to redefine the American identity to counter this new sovereign movement. They contrast the source's view of a moral, productive working class, one that's focused on building a future, with their allegation that the establishment intentionally promotes deeply flawed politicians. The source even cites a specific, highly controversial political candidate in Maine as an example, arguing the establishment elevates pessimistic figures with dark pasts just to deliberately degrade the productive identity of the citizenry. Furthermore, the source proposes a genuinely fascinating theory about media behavior. They argue that the endless media hysteria, what's often labeled Trump derangement syndrome, is actually a psychological defense mechanism. They claim that the media's obsession with minor details, like health rumors or someone napping during a cabinet meeting, is a deliberate distraction. It's essentially a way for those invested in the old global order to completely avoid talking about the massive systemic economic changes that are actually taking place. To bring this entire narrative together, the speakers rely on a really powerful analogy derived from Machiavelli. The core belief of the source is that, at the end of the day, political attacks are ultimately driven by the protection of financial comfort zones. Think about it. When you try to do something fundamentally new, the people who attack you the hardest are the ones invested in the model you're overturning. Why? Because that old system is exactly where they made their money and secured their power. And that leaves us with a truly compelling framework to consider. We've explored the source's claims about a centuries-old economic war hiding just beneath the surface of our daily news. So I want to leave you with this provocative question. How does understanding this theoretical battle between the physical production of the American system and the financial extraction of the old international order change the way you decode today's political headlines? Does it make the chaos make a little more sense? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.